So this is part 2 of James Shore joining us on and talking about A-frame architecture and nullable infrastructure wrappers, also known as Nullables. What I did since last week is added a couple of things that we'll get to. Basically, some more things that are adapters in Hexagonal that can be turned into Nullables in the nullable infrastructure wrapper. So that'll be interesting to see, because last time we looked at the random as basically an external piece of state, an external infrastructure or hardware, depending on what you want to call it. So we have a little bit of work to do to finish up from last time, and then we'll get to this. We're using, or at least we're going to try to use code together today instead of mob.sh, so we'll see how that goes.
Yeah, it could go well, it could go poorly. Yeah, we haven't tried it yet, so but we can always fall back to mob.sh if
exactly. Yeah,
necessary.
And that's live streaming for you.
Yeah,
mistakes and all. Anything, James? Why don't you introduce yourself, since some people may not have seen you before?
All right. Yeah, I guess I didn't do that last time. So hi, everybody. I'm James Shore. I've been around the Agile and extreme programming community for many years. I wrote a book called The Art of Agile Development, which is now out in a second edition. This is the one with the goldfish. That's makes it better. And it's sort of a how-to guide for doing Agile well, and all the various flavors of that, from planning and stakeholder management all the way down into coding and evolutionary design and test-driven development as well.
So I think I mentioned that James's book, Art of Agile Development, is awesome. I just basically on a recent trip, I had some time in an airplane, and so I basically was skimming through it and rereading it. It's like, oh, all good stuff. For those of you who have not seen it before, let me sort of give you the rundown on what this little application is that we're going to be working with. So it's a game of Yacht, which is known as Yahtzee. It's basically a dice game. The idea is it helps if you have the server up. That certainly helps. So let's run this. So it's a Spring Boot based application. It doesn't use all that much of Spring Boot, but uses enough. Uses Spring MVC for and Timeleaf, which is a template layout system. Let's start the game. We roll a dice. You get 5 dice. You get to re-roll some of them if you want. The idea is you put your rolls into different categories, and it gets scored differently depending on what you rolled and what the categories are. So we took this roll, which is 1, 4, 5, 2, 2, and we put it into, and we said, let's keep the 2s. We'll re-roll. That didn't help much. Let's hold on to the 2s, re-roll. And we got 1 more 2, so we'll score it as 2s. So a few things happen, which is new since last time, is, so it's put the rolls here. That was the same as last time. We got a score of 6 because there were 3 dies that had 2, so it's 2 plus 2 plus 2. And then it basically sent across to this little service that's running, and we see that the score shows up here, and we also fetch the average score. So over time, that average will change. How useful that is, not very. It's basically an artificial thing just to show that we can both send information from the application outward, as well as fetch information from an external system. And it does those as separate tasks, and we'll see some of that today. So right now, there is this DiceRoller that has injected into it a die roller. So last time is when we basically did the nullable infrastructure stuff. So that's the stuff we added last time to the die roller. And so where we left it was we wanted the dice roller. So die roller rolls an individual single die, and you get basically 1 to 6. The dice roller runs basically throws all the dice, right? All 5 dice of the game. That's why there's a 5 here. And so I think, James, you wanted to do something around switching, or basically had sort of sketched out this code to move the rolling multiple into the die roller, and then basically getting rid of this dice roller thing. Does that sound right?
Yeah. So one of the things that's different between hexagonal architecture and A-frame architecture is where the UI work happens, and also how much work is done in the application layer versus the logic layers. Maybe that's a difference, maybe not. But one of the things that I noticed when I was looking, at this code last time, was that DiceRoller was doing more than I would expect for the application layer.
Right.
And when we looked at it more closely, it looked like, yeah, we can split that apart, put some of the logic into infrastructure. The multiple dice rolling is something that infrastructure can handle. And the decisions about how many dice to roll, originally I said, I think that's domain logic. I actually think that might be UI logic. And I think that might be what's worth looking at today is actually how does UI logic work in hexagonal versus A-frame architecture? Because again, I'm trying to come into this fresh so that when we talk about it online, I'm sort of experiencing it for the first time.
Mm-hmm.
But one thing that I noticed was that if you pull up the project view, it looks like all of your UI is actually in your adapters. I think it's specifically under in. Yep. And that is a major difference between A-frame architecture. Finally, that's a major difference between A-frame architecture and hexagonal architecture, because in A-frame, I'm going to draw this little card again because I didn't keep it from last time. Of course, in A-frame, we've got app and UI on the top, and then we've got that traffic copying, infrastructure, and logic. And I'm going to hold this up to the camera again. So there's that. And that app/UI does include the UI. So basically, application layer is where the code starts and what controls where the code goes. So it's very concrete in that way. Whereas one thing that took me a long time to understand with hexagonal was this left-right thing. What does that mean? It has no meaning in the code, right? It's just, this is sort of conceptually how the flow goes from left to right. So anyway, I thought that would be something that we could look at this time, but it all starts by making DiceRoller or die roller able to do multiple numbers. So I was hoping we could continue with that from last time.
Yeah, and we can talk a bit more about sort of the details around the inbound or input or driving adapters and sort of where UI specific code crosses over into sort of who cares how this got triggered, some intention, some use case, something got started.
Yeah. I think that could be a really interesting thing to talk about. I know you spent some time doing the services and so forth, but it might be more interesting to do the UI part first.
Hey, I'm not wasted effort.
No, we'll get to it for sure.
Yeah.
So yeah, we left off. We have this roll multiple. So I think we just implement it. How do you want to do the pair programming this time? Last time I did a lot of navigating, and you did a lot of driving.
I mean, that worked.
Maybe this time we can switch back and forth more.
I mean, that worked for me. But you know, since you're sort of the nullable expert, I'm happy to have you navigate. But if you want to drive more, that's fine too.
No, let's go ahead and start out. Just have you implement this.
Okay. So let's go and create this method, being the die roller. Count.
How about num dice?
Thank you. And so we're going to say what? Loop. And we're going to basically Create list integer. Add. So we're going to say roll. And then run dice. Oops. All right. So we think that'll work.
I think it'll work too. Fingers crossed. Yeah.
Yep. All right.
Now, one of the things I want to call out, I sort of mentioned this last time, but I want to call out how on line 15, we're using the null version of the DiceRoller. But because we're implementing the DiceRoller with an embedded stub, this is still a real test. Like it's actually testing real behavior. We can count on this properly working. It's really only.
I had it disabled, so let me run it again. Okay.
Oh. Does it actually work?
Does it actually work? And it does. Okay.
It looks like it does.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah. So yeah, and if you were to do something to break it, then like say, I less than.
Oh, to actually break the code. So yeah, so if we did our loop wrong, I less than or equal.
Yeah.
And that it does indeed break it.
Yeah.
And that one is that if you don't specify anything, it falls back to 1 because it ran out of the pre-programmed ones.
Right. And I kind of would like it to throw an exception if it runs out of the pre-programmed ones, because this situation, because that one is legit. I don't know how hard that would be to program.
Wouldn't be too hard. So right now, the reason that's happening is we've got this values that we create, but then we basically remove it as we're sort of propagating through.
Yeah.
And then we return 0, which turns into 1 if the size is 0. Do you want a time box changing that? Or do you want to skip it?
Let's just do it. I don't think it's going to take us very long.
Okay.
But so let's put a test in that says something along the lines of NullRoller throws exception when it runs out of values.
Yep.
Or configured NullRoller, something like that.
Yeah. It's out configured.
Yeah.
Let me fix case.
I don't know about you, but I'd put that underneath the previous test because it's a sort of a specialized version of how it can be configured.
Okay.
Or not here, but I'd put it at the very bottom.
Oh, okay.
Because we say it returns 1 and it can't be configured when it isn't configured.
Gotcha.
That it can be configured, and then we're talking about the special case of what happens when it can be configured.
Yep. So we're going to use the create null version, right? And what number would you like to use?
2.
So we're going to roll. And then we're going to, so here's where if we roll again, we expect this to throw an exception.
Yeah.
Illegal state exception? Or do you want a specialized one?
No, I think that's fine.
Could also be no such element. I don't know if that's any better.
Yeah, no such element. Actually, I like that one.
Okay, yeah, because that's the standard one that gets returned. No such element when you exceed the actual list. So that's what we expect to throw. All right. So we expect this to fail because it won't throw an exception. Oh,
Oh, did we not fix the?
we didn't undo our force break. Let's do that.
That's on me. I should have caught that.
That's why we got tests. All right, so we expected one failure. It failed as expected with no throwable being thrown.
Yeah. So I have a thought about how to do this, but I'd be interested in your thought. My original thought was that, well, there's two ways we could do it. We could do it sort of the cheapo way, the hacky way, or we could do it the pretty way. And I'm not sure which one's actually better. I think that the hacky way is to have values be null when it's not passed in. And the pretty way would be to set a flag when it's not passed in. And either way, we either check to see if it's null or we check the flag.
So there's
on line 66.
There is a third way.
Okay.
Instead of removing, we basically have an index that just gets incremented. And
well, then what would we do on 66? Just leave it as size equals 0?
Yeah, because if we don't specify the size is 0, because
I think that I like that. That's nice, and that's actually what Suigi looks equivalent to what Suigi is proposing in the chat, I think.
Let's see, change the values field to a stream. Initialize it with an infinite stream by default. Infinite stream. Boy, I haven't done infinite streams, so if you have the code snippet for that, please share it. But we'll do current. Start that at 0. So that'll be the same. That'll be the same. And this changes to get index current ++. I think that's right.
Yeah, I think so. Let's see if the test passed.
So, it returned index out of bounds exception. So we could either accept that as our exception, or we could translate the exception. Or we could explicitly do an if test for it.
Yeah, I'd like to throw a descriptive error message. I don't actually care which exception we use, but I'd like to have a better message saying something like, no more dice configured on null die roller or something like that. So we're going to have to do an if statement, or I probably prefer an if statement rather than a try catch in this case.
Yeah.
And throw an exception. In that case, we can throw whatever we want.
Yeah.
I think no such element exception still makes sense.
Okay. So let's first do if current greater than values size.
Yeah, it's going to be greater than or equal to.
I always get those confused. And we're going to throw. So you said no such element. Let's see if that works. Then we'll add on the. Yep, that works. Then we'll additionally say not only instance of, we'll say has message. And what would you like the message to say?
Let's go with no more elements configured. In null die roller.
Okay, so that's going to fail. All right, I'll just grab that. And that should pass. So Lexler asks, why not throw an exception at line 68? So the idea is that if you call the random stub with nothing, or basically the create null with nothing, we want that to just be okay. That still is valid. It just will keep returning 0. Here, though, if you explicitly say, here's a configured die or die values, we want to use up just those and then run out, which is why there's sort of this difference between these two things.
Yeah, and now that I look at this, I don't love that values.size equals 0, because that doesn't speak very clearly. I would rather use something like a flag, which is that says configured. Or I kind of like the infinite stream, but I don't think I want to spend the time on that. Also, that's even more complicated.
Yeah.
I'm always thinking about who's going to read this code and how can I make it as clear as possible. Before we make any changes, though, I'd like to, on the left-hand side, on the test, scroll up to higher. The original test that says we return 1.
Sorry.
Yeah, line 26. Can we change that to say infinite ones and then demonstrate that we are returning at least more than 1?
Should I just duplicate the assert?
Yeah, I'd do 3 because as a programmer, I only know 0, 1, and 3.
There's no 2. Yeah, so Lexer says we could say is empty, but I'm not sure that I know. So we could say is empty because that's the same thing as size is 0.
That actually speaks
is that
more
better?
Clearly.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is better.
Okay.
Yeah, honestly, this is probably good enough.
So I'm just going to do this. Just want to see this one fail with the exception. Great.
Yeah.
All right.
That's nice. Yeah, and I think if we wanted to be super clear on this, and I don't know that it would be worth doing, what we could do is we could factor out the 2 halves on line 69. We could factor out return 0 as return infinite zeros, and else to say return configured values or something like that. But I don't know that is actually better.
Yeah, I tend to sort of factor out something like this because it's somewhat of a guard. It's a guard-like clause. So I would factor this out into require have more. What are we calling them? Configured
have
values.
Configured elements, or have more configured roles. Roles, not elements. I think is better. And for that matter, let's change line 80 to be no more roles configured in null DiceRoller.
Yeah.
Elements is kind of weird.
Let's see.
I think that's good enough.
Yeah.
People do complain about ravioli code, as the opposite of spaghetti code that's been split up into too many pieces that you can't really see how it all fits together. So yeah, I think that's good enough.
Yeah, I think it at least is the same level of sort of indentation, if nothing else. All right.
Okay, well, let's check that in.
What would you like to say?
Add DiceRoller dot roll multiple. If that's actually what we did. What is it?
It is what we added. So I'm curious, do you do sort of, or do you care about sort of present tense versus past tense of your commits? Like, is it add or added?
So I have the unfortunate condition that I'm kind of anal, but I also don't care. So I read once that, the official Linus Torvalds blessed approach to commit messages is that they be less than, I think, 60 characters, and they be phrased in present tense. So I try to follow that, but honestly, I don't care at all.
Yeah.
Like, It does not matter. There are so many more important things to care about than that.
It was just one of those things that popped into my head. It's like, is that add or added? Because we actually, by the time we check it in, it has been added. But I'm pretty laid back on that as well.
Yeah. So maybe because also I do things in public, and the nature of doing things in public is if you do anything wrong, people will nitpick you. So I do tend to try to do things sort of the right way, unless I have a valid and thoughtful reason to do it another way. But if you do it, if you wrote 3 lines here and made them all past tense or future tense, I'd be like, that's odd.
That would be odd.
But I wouldn't stop you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Stephen Eggermont says, you won't get comments about ravioli code from me. I do small talk. Really? You do small talk?
I'm impressed that people are still doing small talk.
Like real small talk, or one of the variations? I'm curious.
Yeah. I've talked to a number of people. Of course, extreme programming came from people who were avid small talkers. Yeah. And I've never programmed small talk myself, but I know that it has a fanatical following among the people who've used it.
So let's see. So we now have roll multiple, but nobody's going to be using it yet.
Yeah. So let's go ahead and go into the DiceRoller. Not dice roll, but DiceRoller.
Not DiceRoller.
And let's refactor it to use roll multiple.
All right. So now we're going to do this. So this method is interesting. The whole thing is interesting. So reroll's empty. So assuming that works, then reroll list kept dice. So then roll the rest. So I'm going to inline this.
Okay.
And then if we call DiceRoller roll multiple, this should be the yacht dice count minus die rolls size.
Yeah.
I might be off by 1, but
I just did a little mental check. If we have 5 dice already, then we're going to add 0. So that sounds right to me.
Well, we appear to be off by 1. I think. If not, then yeah, that's even worse. Sorry, froze there for a second.
So can you run the tests again?
Because when I inlined it, I goofed. I didn't actually add it.
Oh yeah, that would do the trick.
Let's take this.
The funny thing is, I was just thinking to myself, maybe we can even inline the add all, but yeah.
So this is add all as well.
And I believe you have an extra closing parenthesis.
Nope, that's okay.
No, you don't. No, you don't.
All right, so that works.
Good. So scroll up a bit, or yeah, thanks. So roll is just re-roll, and then we've got re-roll. Can you bring up the test for DiceRoller?
Mm-hmm. Let me flip that over to the other side.
Okay, so let me just look through these. So the multiple rolls should use the die roller. So we create a die roller, and then we roll, right? Re-roll keeping 2 dice results in new roll, including kept dice. Okay, yeah. So what's interesting to me is that the dice roller doesn't actually maintain any state. It just has this list of kept dice.
Right.
So yeah, that sort of confirms my belief that DiceRoller needs to go away. I don't think it's really doing anything interesting. The only real bit of interesting logic here is line 11, where we're defining the domain logic of how many dice we're allowed to have.
Right. Because this is really a stateless service.
Right.
It's you say here's how many. Roll is really just roll with nothing being kept. And kept is like, well, do this and then return, right? So this is this is basically a stateless service with sort of functional like behavior.
Right. When you say service, what do you mean in this case?
So service I'm using sort of generally as does not hold basically domain state.
Okay.
Yeah.
Not like the distributed computing type of service.
No. Just right. Yeah. So service as in a layer, or as in a singleton, which I know gets a lot of bad press, but
yeah, I guess I call those sorts of things modules. It's a collection of functions.
Okay.
And then you've got reroll keeping 4 dice results in new roll, including kept dice. I don't understand why you have both of those tests. They seem like the same thing.
Let's see. It was just a variation of checking that if I hold on to 2, that works. If I hold on to 4, that works.
Got it. Okay. So yeah, this gets us into what I was saying earlier, that I think if we sort of follow our noses on this, where this takes us is looking at that UI distinction between hexagonal and A-frame architecture. Do you mind if I drive for a little bit?
No, go for it. Just let me do
Because what I want to do is I want to look at the existing architecture you have, and that will allow me to sort of control the screen, and also you're the subject matter expert on that.
Yep. All right. So I did a mob next, so you can share your screen.
Okay.
And we'll see how windows float around.
Okay, so let me go ahead and do a mob start. There we go. Okay, so we've got DiceRoller and DiceRoller.
Oops, sorry about that. Hold on.
So what I want to look at is just how things are put together from the top level. So whenever I'm looking at code that I'm not familiar with, I will always try to find where the main routine is, and I'll just sort of trace through it in that way. So I assume Yacht application is your main.
Yes.
Then we have Spring taking over the world, and create. Oh, service must be a Spring thing, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, but it follows the service pattern, which is where it came from back in early 2000s.
Right. So we create the game service, we create a die roller, and pass into the game service new dice roller, HP store category notifier, HP average score fetcher. Okay, so game service, let's find that. What's the hotkey for? There it is. Then game service is here under application. So that's really, Yacht application is just sort of the stub that, or the code that just gets everything going, and I assume it's not tested. Yeah,
so it's the composition root or configurator or bootstrap assembler, whatever you want to call that thing.
Right. And game service takes the dice roller, score, blah, 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 lots of dependency injection. And then we've got start, which I assume is called by Spring at some point.
No, so that's triggered by the UI. So when you hit the home page, we get the welcome screen, and there's a button on there that does a post to the UI that basically then it triggers the start. So that instantiates the game to get things going. So that way you can basically have the thing play multiple games without restarting the server.
Okay. So what actually calls into the game service?
So the game service is that in Hexagonal is the dividing line between the outside world and sort of the application. And so the UI talks directly to it. So in sort of traditional Hexagonal or ports and adapters, the service would be a port.
Okay.
But I don't use the term ports on inbound side of things because I reserve the word port for an actual interface for dependency inversion, not for just something you can plug into.
Let me phrase it a little differently. I'm actually asking a very sort of practical question, which is how, if Spring application.run does something, what does it do?
Oh, what does that do? So that is Spring's, what it does is it scans all the code, looks for annotations, keeps track of, builds its inversion of control container, instantiates classes, kicks off processes, configures and connects to databases, all basically of the startup bootstrap work.
Right. So that sets up, I mean, this is ultimately a website. So there's going to be an HTTP request that comes in. So we make an HTTP request for get on the root. Spring intercepts that HTTP request, and that goes where?
That goes into the adapter in web. You'll see a Yacht Controller.
Yacht Controller. And what configures that?
So if you look at Yacht Controller, so why don't you open that up? There's on line 18 this annotation. Yeah, so as part of that scanning process, one of the things that it looks for are annotations like this controller. So controller, what it'll do is it'll say, okay, I need to remember that there's a controller here. There may be multiple ones of them. And it sets up a routing table. So it starts the internal web server doing all sorts of work internally that we don't really care about. Eventually what'll happen is when that GET request comes in, it's handed off to Spring MVC, and Spring MVC says, do I know who has something for this route? So if there's a GET, if there's a post comes into /start-game, it knows to call the method start game there on line 29.
Got it. Okay. So I don't actually see any routes for the home page.
So the home page is a special case. If you look in the resources directory under static, what happens is if it hits a page like the root, it basically says, well, I didn't find a programmed route. Did I find a static page? And it found index.html and says, let me serve that up as a static page.
Okay. So this is what I'm looking for. I want to be able to trace this through and find it. And the A-frame architecture is designed to make it very easy to trace code through. Spring is also easy to trace through once you know how it works.
Yes, like anything else, once you know how it works.
Like anything else. Yeah. But with A-frame architecture, what I'm specifically trying to do is avoid magic and make it so that you can start at the main routine and literally just follow the declarations, bam, 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 and see how it works. So what we would do, and what we might want to try to get to if we're refactoring this to use A-frame architecture, is, and I don't know the degree to which this is possible, but we'd want to encapsulate Spring behind an infrastructure wrapper, behind an adapter, so that we could trace the code through to see from main everything that happens. Now that's a lot to ask with something like Spring.
And so I'm gonna say that, like, because what you're describing basically can't be done, right? You can't. Spring is doing, like it or not, Spring is doing a lot of magic for you. Like I think a lot of frameworks do a lot of magic. Yeah. And I don't know that you can make that explicit. I've found that with this code organization, if you know where the UI is, because there are multiple different inputs, right? There's a view controller, there's a yacht controller, there could be other controllers. Once you know where's the UI coming from, then following the code is actually fairly straightforward. It does mean that you do have to know the framework you're working with.
And that's fair.
Yeah.
That's fair. That's the case of everything. And I do try to avoid frameworks that have excessive magic, but people who make frameworks love magic because it feels real good, and it also makes for awesome demos. And it allows you to type less characters.
Well, and you know, and I'm fairly pragmatic in that if you're doing Java and you're doing anything that creates a web UI or web app or services, you're going to use Spring or something like it. There are some frameworks that are a bit more descriptive, but even there, it's not always obvious how to find how to trace. You still have to figure out how do you define the routes, the routes, and figure out where that tracks to. But yeah, I mean, you know, frameworks by definition are general purpose and
right.
You know,
well, general purpose is easy, sort of. I mean, the difference between a framework and a library, and I'm not going to argue with you. I mean, I'm agreeing that if we're using Spring, we have to work within its strengths and limitations. Yeah. But I don't agree that everything has to be a framework. Everything has to be mysterious magic. I think you do have the ability as a creator of tools for other people to use to choose to create them in a framework style, which is where you own the world and call other people.
Sure.
Or you can create them in a library style, which is where they own the world and they call you.
Right.
Now, the disadvantage of the library style is that there is a certain amount of boilerplate that people who use your library have to create.
Right.
And it's a little harder to say, well, just type in this one line of code and get going. But the advantage is that as a user of a library, you have a lot more control over how you structure your system, which proponents of framework say is a disadvantage. There are people who say, you know, if I'm using Spring or if I'm using Angular or if I'm using React, there is the way that this framework is used, and I can always find anything no matter what. The downside is, of course, once you go outside of what that framework can do, is now you spend a lot of time. You spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to get out of the magic, and you spend a lot of time trying to understand the magic so you can make the tool do what you want it to do rather than what it wants to do. So on balance, when I have the option, I will look for a library rather than a framework. Yeah. But there are some ecosystems, and Spring's one of them, where it's such a dominant force. In Ruby, you've got Rails. And in JavaScript these days, you used to have AngularJS, and now you've got mostly React or Express. And there are these things that just sort of dominate the industry. And not using them isn't necessarily a good idea, but I will still shake my fist and yell at the clouds about this.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because I think J. Hill was playing around with what would it look like to create or to use a more library-driven kind of thing. And in the back of my head, when he was talking about that, I was like, we would be interesting to, and I've wanted to do this anyway, is like, it would be interesting to say, okay, we are now moving from Spring to XYZ library. What would have to change in this code base in order to do that? The adapters would obviously have to change heavily, but you know, it would be interesting to sort of see what that looks like. So. You know, if we ever have time to do that, maybe we do that. Otherwise, I'll probably do that myself sometime next year.
Yeah, Argim's making the point that it's nice to see in main web server equals web server.start, some config, server.serve, some routes data. And that is, in fact, exactly what I like to see. It's just really nice to have everything visible. The disadvantage of configuration over what's the phrase? We want convention over configuration.
Right.
The disadvantage of convention over configuration has become sort of mysterious. And as your needs get more complicated, that convention gets more and more obtuse with, under this circumstance, the convention is this, and under that circumstance, the convention is that. Now, Spring has configuration.
So that's interesting because there are multiple ways to configure the routes, and there actually is a way. I generally don't use it because it's not the common way people do it, and so I sort of like you, I do a lot of stuff in public, and I don't want to confuse people by doing things differently. But there is a way to set up the routes in a way, basically in the main application, where it's more clear. Hey, when I go to /start game, it calls this class this method kind of thing.
So that's sort of what I was getting at when I said I wanted to be able to trace through and see things. And I'm not a Spring expert. I've barely used Spring. Go ahead.
So I was going to say the problem with that is, and maybe it's actually one of those pains you want to feel, with sufficiently complex a number of routes. The main part of your application does get more dense. With if you've got 85 endpoints, do I want to see 85 endpoints all in one main class? Probably not. So maybe I'd refactor that out into do this set of endpoints, do this set of endpoints. So I just convinced myself. Never mind.
Yeah.
That's what I do. Yeah.
Yeah. And to be fair, I don't think there's a lot of value in the duplication that you get with routing code. If you've got a router that says this endpoint goes to this identically named class and this, with a get on it, it is nice to be able to just say, look, this is where things are. So there's, as with everything else, there's a line to be drawn.
Yeah.
But let me go back. So now that I understand what's going on, we've got Yacht Controller, and one difference between A-frame architecture and hexagonal architecture is that because this Yacht Controller is basically the entry point for the code, it would be front and center. Mm-hmm. It would actually be under application or UI. Mm-hmm. And everything else would be either other classes in that same folder or more likely subfolders, packages mm-hmm. underneath that, so that you could go in and you could see, or even really at the top level, you might have Yacht application and then Yacht Controller at the top level, mm-hmm. To really make it in your face clear. This is where execution starts. Mm-hmm. After, of course, Spring does its thing, right. But this is where we start. And so we see start game, and then we call game service.start, and game service.start is running here.
Right.
And that does a new game. And then we redirect to roll result, and we get a model. Where does that?
So the model is more magic. Spring says, here's a model. Please fill it up with stuff that I'll use when I generate the template. So the model is basically a map. And it basically associates named things that have a string name that are going to be referenced in the template, basically with objects, generally DTOs, Java beans that have getters and setters. I mean, so yeah.
So model is something that Spring provides, and it's mm-hmm. basically a dictionary. It looks like.
Yeah, it's basically a dictionary or a map. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so now we've got this sort of unstructured collection of names and values.
Right.
We're going to add our current score to the model. We're going to add a role property to the model, right. Or attribute. We're going to add categories to the model. So we're now basically cluttering the model up with all this stuff that we care about.
Right. We're putting all the stuff in the model that the template will basically pull from to generate the HTML.
So here's another difference, potentially, between A-frame architecture and hexagonal. You're using Spring's model to store basically your view model. View model being the data that your view cares about.
Correct.
I consider that part of the domain.
You consider the view model part of the domain.
Yeah.
So,
or rather, I consider it not so much part of domain, but part of logic.
So that's interesting. What if you have different ways of presenting information based on either the view or the way that somebody's requested that information? So let's say I have a regular HTML UI, but I also have a REST API, and I also have text message. So basically interacting with the core of the application with different mechanisms.
Yeah, and so probably what we would be doing there is the view model. They might have different view models for each of those different displays, assuming that they're complicated enough that I'm not just putting that in the view itself, because I don't always have a view model. Sometimes I just have a view. And the view, but those view models would be translating the underlying domain model.
Right. So my views are the view models, and they're specific to each adapter because they're custom for each one. So they're doing the work of translating the domain into that particular view. But because the adapters are separate, because there's one for each type of interaction, right? There's one for the web, there's one for the view front end, there would be one for if you're playing over WebSockets or something like that. Each one has, they're isolated from each other so that changing one doesn't magically change another. Being able to say, you know what, we're not using the server-side generated one anymore. We have our view front end, so we could completely delete it, and nothing else would break. So the isolation of those adapters, to me, is one of the top 5 things that I think hexagonal architecture really makes easier than even some other similar architectures, is that each adapter is especially the input ones, they're replaceable and deletable without it affecting anything else.
Okay, let me keep looking at this. So we've got adds current score 2. That is a function down here that takes the model and adds. Do these all have to be strings, or is that something that you're doing just to make it easier?
It's just easier.
Okay. And then we're returning roll-result, which I presume is some bit of magic to tell Spring to do something.
Yes, so that is the name of the view. So we basically have filled in Spring's model, which is just this dictionary. And now we say, here's the template, run the template with the model that we just populated. Right. So that's going to be in the templates directory under resources.
Got it. Okay. That's why it's all in the model. That's why you've got this sort of undifferentiated model class, because the actual view doesn't have any logic in it.
Right.
So if we look in here, there's all of our things.
Right.
Okay. I understand better now.
Okay.
Yeah. So Yacht Controller is doing the translation from the domain to the view.
Right. It's translating whatever request. Is it a get? Okay, I'm probably going to populate a model. If it's a post, I'm going to execute some command on the domain. That's generally most of your stuff is one of the two.
Now, how come you have add current score, but the rest of them are just add attribute?
It was basically some refactoring that I'd done because I used add current score 2 in multiple places and add categories 2 in multiple places.
Got it.
It's a little bumpy ride reading that one, but
yeah. Okay. No, I think I understand what's going on here, and I take back what I said before about this being in the logic layer, because this is just the structure that makes roll results template work.
Right.
I wouldn't put that in the logic.
Okay.
I wouldn't make a special class for that because it's too much work.
Yeah.
It's
and specific to a specific kind of usage, which may not. Yeah.
Now, something I do, and I'm just going to sort of throw this out here, is I would be more likely to make one controller for each view, for each template, than to have them all in one big controller. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't like for this game. It's all in one because there's not a lot. But generally,
there's really only one thing. Roll result is your page. That's the whole thing, right?
Yeah, and then but it's true. Like for a non-trivial application, I will generally have one controller per sort of set of use cases that are generally a single view. Yeah.
Yeah. So, for example, when you say start game, that URL doesn't really exist in any meaningful way. Is that an actual URL? It goes to there and it returns does this redirect return a 301 or is that an internal redirect?
No, it returns a 301. In fact, there's a test against that makes sure that it returns a 301.
Okay, good. So this is, you go to /start game, that calls gameservice.start, returns a 301 status code redirect, permanent redirect, I believe 301 is.
I actually don't know which redirect it uses underneath. It's probably temporary, but I don't know for sure.
But it uses a 300 redirect of some sort.
Exactly.
Redirects to /roll result, which does this stuff.
Right.
And then roll result, of course, has a bunch of different gets or posts.
Right.
Looks like mostly posts in it. And those do things and then redirect back to the get,
right?
The roll result.
Right. So each post represents a button, and it's the post redirect get pattern. So the button, you click a button, it does a post. Server does a redirect. Browser says, now get the page, right? And everything works. And
the reason, of course, for that pattern is that when you do a refresh on it, it doesn't ask you if you want to repost.
Exactly.
Yeah. No, this is pretty clean. As with anything else, when you first look at it, you're like, what is this stuff? Yeah. But, you know, when you get into it, it starts to make sense. Okay.
So I just noticed we've been going for about a little over an hour. Would you like to take a break?
Yeah, I think this is a good point for a quick break.
Yeah. All right, so let's take a 5-minute coffee break, and then we'll come back.
Okay, so we're looking at this Yacht Controller. Again, the reason I'm doing this is partly just to understand what's going on here. And because I have not looked at this outside of talking to you about it. Okay. But more specifically, I want to look at how we can get rid of DiceRoller.
Right.
So Yacht Controller makes a lot of sense to me now. It's basically the roll result controller with a start game and a game over added in.
Yeah.
But all of the rest of it, all the posts are really posts that are for the purposes of Yacht Controller.
Right.
And the magic for displaying it is right here in get mapping. So, for example, at some point, so now I want to understand how your domain comes in. We've got DiceRoll, we've got the game, we've got roles, scoreboard. I would assume game is sort of the overall container for all the pieces of the game.
Yes.
And so I would expect game to be referred to in game service. And there it is.
There it is.
There's the game.
The one and only game for now, yes.
Yeah, yeah. But it's not a singleton, it looks like.
Well, right now it's not, but there can only be one. But it's a different one every time you say start.
I find singletons to be generally an anti-pattern, so I'm in favor of not having it be a singleton.
Yeah, so singletons are interesting. Like for services, by which I mean things that, like game services is a service. The only state it has is game, which is technically sort of not quite right, because it really shouldn't have that state at all. It should be going to some other thing that says, hey, give me the game for it. But that's a shortcut I took until I add the database stuff. But otherwise, it's just collaborating with other services that do things.
Right. Yeah.
So the service itself,
the reason I'm not in
so the service itself is a singleton, but that's managed by Spring for us.
I see. And because services in Spring are just all singletons.
Unless you do otherwise, Although
generally they're supposed to be stateless bundles of functions.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah. The reason I don't like singletons is because they're really complicated globals, and they have all the problems that that globals have, complicated or not. Which is that you come to rely on it because it's a global, because you can access it from any part of your system you do. And now when you want two of them, you're in for a world of hurt, because you've got to find every place that you use the singleton and pass it in as a parameter. So one thing that I do in a lot of my code that looks ugly but leads to better designs overall is that if something needs to use something, it comes in as a parameter.
Right.
There's no service locators, there's no singletons, there's no global pseudo or otherwise, because these service locators, they're also globals. It's a global repository of global things. So if you want something, you either get it passed in or you create it for yourself. That's sort of a design philosophy I try to follow, but I don't always follow. Wheatlaw says the only good singleton is a stateless singleton, which I'd have to agree with that. And a stateless singleton is really just a bundle of functions, which in Java has to go into a class.
Right.
But in that case, if it's stateless, it doesn't need to be a singleton. It could be something called a monotype. A monotype is a class with nothing but static members.
Yeah, in Java, that would generally be frowned upon because the static stuff is a compile time coupling that's where you get into trouble. So all of these services and other things are passed in as parameters through passing as parameters into constructor. So you get one and if you need it for more than one method, otherwise, and that's actually generally the way it does. And so Spring respects that, which is one of the reasons I actually like the way Spring handles this is most of my tests, or all of my non-Spring tests, I can still test Spring classes because I can control what gets passed in. There's no magic behind the scenes lookup. Yeah,
which is nice.
Otherwise I would not use it.
Now, what's the problem with statics being at compile time?
Because then for testing purposes, you can't replace it with something else. And then you also have the problem of especially if it's something that's public and somebody's relying on it, you now have a binary compatibility problem if you try to change it. So in general, it's don't rely on a static reference to something. Hand it in as a parameter somewhere.
Right. Yeah, I think the two constraints you're putting on that are constraints that don't necessarily have to be true all the time. So one is if you're publishing something, I would say be very careful about what you publish. But I don't think you would say that this is what I don't want to do is treat all my code as if it was published, even when it's not, even though I don't think that's what you're saying. And then the other point is, well, you can't replace it. That's actually something, that's where a lot of this nullables and A-frame architecture stuff comes from, is not wanting to be in a world where you need lots of complexity because you're trying to replace things all the time, but instead just do things with the things that you have, rather than making doubles or things that have to be replaced.
It's more that if you're getting something from the outside and you're accessing it through a statically coupled, right? So there's a static method and you're often calling a lookup, but sometimes it's just accessing a function somewhere else. That means that like Wheatlaw says, like it might be a utility class, which is where there's probably okay because it itself doesn't have state, and you're not going to substitute. You're not going to say, I want to use a different substring for testing purposes. No, I'm going to call string.substring, although you actually don't call it that way. But if you had some utility that said, hey, trim out the spaces, if that's used inside of code buried deep and you need to be able to modify that so you can observe changes, that's where it's problematic. Because there's just no way to say, hey, when you want to call this class's static method, call this other thing over here that I can control from a test. That's just, well, you can always do things in interesting ways using tools like PowerMockito and PowerMock and other things, but that's just bad.
Yeah. But those sorts of things can be designed around. For example, when I'm using third-party code, I almost always put it inside of a wrapper.
Right, exactly. Right. I mean, that's exactly the point is like, don't try to use it directly. Put a wrapper around it, unless it's something that, look, I'm never going to substitute it. It's not something. It's something I'm really relying on as being like baked into the platform. But if it is something third party and it's non-trivial, then absolutely, that's what we do is we wrap it.
Yeah. For example, I typically not wrap the string class on whatever platform I'm using.
Right.
I won't, but I will wrap the crypto classes.
Sure.
Because they tend to be really complicated and there's all this stuff that's easy to get wrong. So, okay. So I'm going back to your code here, just trying to understand it. We've got game service that's got a game we call start. That's the game. So I'm assuming that if I go back to Yacht Controller, I'm going to be seeing a lot of stuff happening with game service, and I am. And game service is acting as sort of a mediator here. So game service is being provided to us by Spring.
Yes. And so this is the bridge that we saw in the Yacht application, that @bean method says to Spring, right? So this is bridging the gap. It's basically saying, I don't want to make my code have to be Spring specific, but I can write some code in the Spring world saying, hey, if you need a game to be, a game service to be injected into a class that Spring controls, here's how you get one.
Right. Okay. So Spring probably knows because through reflection that Yacht Controller wants a game service.
Yeah.
And it sees that you have a bean here called create game service. Right. Is this name important, or is it just the fact that it returns a game service?
It can be important, but if internally it uses that as the key to its internal map of things, but there's only one, so it doesn't matter. So it looks to see, do I know, right? Is Spring aware of anything that has an implementation of game service or that type? And so the method is used if you had multiple different ones and you wanted to tell the difference, but there are better ways to do it than that.
And how often is create game service called?
Once.
So when the server starts up, Spring goes through and it says, I'm going to create a controller and I'm going to pass in a game service. And is controller created on every request, or is that?
No, it's also Singleton.
Okay, so there's one Yacht Controller.
Yeah.
And it's passed in the game service that we have here.
Yeah. Suiji says that bean name can be pretty nasty because when it does matter, it is not, that's true magic. Where it's like, why did it find this one or not find this thing? But
I mean, the good news is that kind of sort of, if I may so, dysfunctional behavior is really common in these frameworks, which is why I asked, right? Because it's got to figure out where the game service is somehow, right? And so we create one Yacht Controller, we create one game service, it passes in, then we do all this stuff. Okay. Now game service is really just a thin wrapper over game.
Pretty much. In fact, before, up until a couple of weeks ago, game service didn't exist.
And that's actually my first instinct here is, boy, this is not pulling its weight.
It's not quite pulling its. So when it didn't have to deal with the notifier and the fetcher, which is what we see here, then it was really like, what's it for? But but now that it's doing notification and fetching from external services, so there's now a bit of coordination to external things. It's starting to pull its weight a little more. And then the realistic thing is you would never have game just one of them. You'd actually look it up in some database by its ID, and then it's all about what game were we talking about. Okay, let me go fetch that, forward it to that one. Then it's really sort of fulfilling its purpose, which is to coordinate the creation and reconstitution of and persistence of domain objects.
Right. So, what would you think about replacing all of these sort of thin wrappers around game with just a get game, and then have the controller operate on the game domain object directly?
So the problem with that, or I guess so if we look at on line 53, the assign role to. One of the things it does is, besides talking to the domain to modify its state, it also notifies this external service, hey, somebody assigned this role. And to me, this is the key part of the application service behavior, is this coordination. If it was all just delegated, then yes. So there are cases, in the specific cases where the controller is just reading information, then it's actually fine for the controller to talk directly to what would be a repository. It's where there are commands being state-changing things that are being executed, where there are basically side effects that I'd want constrained within within here. And the reason why is, again, because there may be multiple different controllers that want to do the same thing. And I'd want to make sure that every time you assign a role, it sends out that notification to the external service.
Right. But there is not presently something like that.
If you look at who calls assign role to, from there, you'll see that there are two different adapters that use that, because this is a sort of an implementation of a little use case. When I assign a role, I want it to change the domain and send a message out.
Okay. So let's go ahead and pull up the view controller too. So view controller what is view controller, and how's it different than?
So this is a controller for an incomplete single page application front end that uses the view framework.
I see. So you're actually doing two different views of the same game.
Yeah, right.
And let's take that as sort of part of the soup, in that we want to, it's not a case that you're refactoring from one to the other, but it's actually, there's good reasons. We've got a mobile version and we've got a web version.
Exactly.
Let's say.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so live coding says is a core struggle he has with architecture. Do you build architecture to grow, or build exactly what you need right now? So I know how I'd respond to that. So what would you say, James?
I say, well, there's two answers to this, and everything is caveated by, when you're in a team environment with existing patterns that you're following, you want to follow those existing patterns. But let's say that you're in a small team where everybody's working together and everybody knows what's going on. In that case, my answer is we build for what we need right now, and we use evolutionary design to evolve that design as we go.
Yep.
How does that differ from what you would say, Ted?
Pretty much what I would say. Especially if you're in like an ensemble, absolutely do just what you need now, because everybody is up to date and aware and has the context for all that stuff. But if you've got pre-existing things, or God forbid you've got a handed down architecture from your architects, then that's a different situation.
But repeated patterns in your code, which people call architecture, but when architecture is repeated patterns, but repeated patterns are duplication. So the question is, how do we manage that?
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got a view controller, which also has a game service, which is doing all the same things in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think given that constraint, I would do it the way that you're doing it here. I would have that thin wrapper around game service that, I mean, I've never liked the service pattern.
It's often misused. Yeah.
And I hate that it's a global. And what I see in a lot of code is the use of the service pattern combined with DTOs to make classes that are nothing but functions and classes that are nothing but data.
Yep.
But good object-oriented programming, and I'm not an object-oriented purist, but object-oriented programming has this beautiful characteristic that we put our data with the functions that operate on it, which means that when one changes, the other can change easily.
Yep.
And when we split that apart into services and DTOs, we end up with something that's just not as nice.
Yeah. And that's definitely the danger. And I see that a lot in lots of Spring applications. And sometimes it's even worse. They don't even have a service that does really much of anything other than usually it wraps the repository. So it's basically the middleman serving no purpose other than being in the middle because it's, I must have controller service repository, right?
Because that's the pattern. That's the architecture.
That's what everybody sees. So monkey see, monkey do. No offense to monkeys. That's that. And this is, for me, this is why I try to promote Hexagonal, because it asks you to put domain front and center and really think about that, and that the service should do only these things, that you should not have any kind of state, and it should only be mostly delegating to other services to retrieve information and then forwarding domain command requests and things like that. But
Yeah.
So live coding was asking a question. Do I build a separate DTO for the view model versus duplicate it between DTO entities, assuming they can be identical? So for me, I'd rather have the duplication of multiple DTOs serving specific concrete purposes. So here we've got Yacht Controller has DTOs as view objects, but it also has DTOs used by the view front-end application through the REST API, and those are different DTOs. They have different purposes. They may look exactly the same, or pretty close, but I want to keep those isolated. And so there is a bit of this to me is always the trade-off I talk about, which is you keep things separate, and you're going to have to copy stuff around, right? So pull information from the DTO to perhaps create a domain object, and then vice versa. When you want to show that domain object, you have to copy it into a view. For me, that's a cost I'm willing to pay to really keep those things separate.
Yeah. What I would love to do, and I don't know that we can, but what I would love to do is figure out a way of making the domain even more front and center, and see what we can do about this service. See if we can get rid of globals, and see where that takes us. I don't know if we can do that. Probably not, because you've got a really clean design here. But I'd like to explore that.
So what would tell me more.
Well, I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know what that's going to look like.
All right.
But I do know that we're pulling on a thread here, which is that DiceRoller doesn't make a lot of sense. So I want to keep pulling on that thread and see where that takes us. But let me just continue looking at this. So we've got View Controller, we've got Yacht Controller. They're both doing assign role to. That's happening when we select category.
Right.
So assign role to. So that's when we say we're going to keep this.
Right.
It's going to put it in this category.
Right.
And at that point, we are both updating the domain model, and we're calling the service saying, here's the role.
Right.
And so it can then later on pull it out of it. At some point we pull it out when we show it, don't we?
So we pull it out of the domain when we show it. What it fetches from the external service layer is the average scores.
Right. So where do we see that? that average scores?
That's part of building the score category view. So if you go into that, and that's basically the DTO.
Mm-hmm. Where's this created?
So this is created so basically they're on line 26. This is saying, give me a view of this domain information. And it's a little ugly, but what it does is basically say, here are the categories, here are the averages. So on line 84, that's where it fetches, it asks the game service, hey, what are the averages for the categories that have been scored?
Right. Okay, there it is, right there.
Yeah.
So when we show that page, we're going to go out to the service, and we're going to get those average values.
Right.
So we ask for the averages from the game service. Averages 4.
It's at the bottom.
Boom, there it is. And it is going to the average score fetcher, which is presumably our external microservice.
Right.
Got it. Yeah. Okay. I don't know if I'm clever enough to come up with a better way of doing this this week. What will happen is over the course of the next week, I'll take a lot of showers, and that's where I do all my best thinking.
Right.
And I might have some ideas at that point. But I'm glad we went through this, because now I feel like I've got a sense of how it all fits together.
Good.
Okay, so let's go back to this. So let me just summarize it. Yacht application, the code starts here in Yacht application. Spring does magic.
Right.
That ultimately results in Yacht Controller being called under Start Game when you access, actually homepage serves the index.html. You press the Start Game button. That's going to call Yacht Controller. It's going to post to Start Game. That's going to redirect with a 300 result. It's going to go out. Client's going to make another request to roll result. That is going to put a bunch of values, mostly strings, under a bunch of names, which Spring is going to magically fill in the roll result template here.
Right.
It's going to render all this stuff out. Out it goes. User presses roll the dice button, which is down at the bottom somewhere. Where's the roll the dice? There it is. It calls the roll the dice. It posts to roll the dice. Game service is told to roll the dice. Game service is a singleton. It is constructed for us, and when it's constructed with a game domain object. And luckily, we can trust that Spring will not intelligently destroy and recreate that service for us, right?
Presumably not, yes.
Presumably not. Let's hope not, because it's got state.
It's got state.
Yeah.
I mean, there's it certainly could happen, which is why it would be bad, because like your machine, it's not Spring's fault, but the machine could crash and start up and you've lost all your state.
Right.
Whereas if it was stored
so eventually somewhere, you're going to store this all in the database and have it come back out. So
right.
It can also, maybe you connect to maybe you've got multiple servers and you connected to a different server.
Exactly.
And right.
Yeah.
So anyway, when we call roll result, it's we calling roll dice, it's getting the game service, which was created here. And when we created the game service, we also created the game. Oh, well, when we started, we created the game. So we're kind of in trouble if we never called the start method on that.
Yes. If you never called start, then yes, you're in big trouble.
Right. So what happens if you manually type in /roll result?
You would get an exception.
Okay. The game crashes. Just checking.
Yep.
Okay. So it tells the service to roll the dice. The service turns around and tells the game to roll the dice using the DiceRoller. And then it redirects back to roll result, and the whole thing starts again.
Yep.
Okay. Got it. So the thing I want to do is I want to get rid of DiceRoller.
I'd like to get rid of it too. Like I hexagonal or otherwise, I think it is now. It's there's something that it like, first of all, the static final, right, the constant basically 5, as you mentioned, that's sort of domain knowledge that should not be here.
It should be in the domain, probably under DiceRoller.
Right. So DiceRoller is the result of it, and should the DiceRoller itself be in the domain? I think I'd be fine with that. We might even be able to move it.
Yeah. But there's not really, it's not really doing anything interesting. I mean, ultimately, it's deciding how many dice to roll.
Correct.
That's all it's really doing. So my thinking here is that there is a little bit of state being kept, which is how many dice do we have? Where is that? And there's a decision to be made about, collecting the dice and rolling the dice. My first reaction in the shower over the last 7 days was that if we think of the UI as separate from the domain, what the UI is doing is it's collecting dice rolls until it's time to do something with them. So the UI, I think it makes sense for the UI to know that it is in a loop, effectively saying, roll 1, roll 2, roll 3. And the question of how many times we get to roll, that to me is a domain question. But the question of how do we do those rolls, that's a UI question. Does that make sense the way I'm phrasing that?
I'm having trouble understanding why the UI would. So if we do the initial roll, it's the domain is the one that has the knowledge of how many have already been rolled, or if it's a new roll that we need to roll all 5. That doesn't feel like the UI may be informed about it, but it's the domain that is the source of that information.
Well, that I think is the main difference between hexagonal and A-frame is the UI in A-frame is control, whereas in hexagonal the UI isn't considered an adapter, right?
But it's still, so the domain is still passive, right? So nothing happens until you do something. Basically trigger it through an incoming adapter.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the same as the A-frame, right? There has to be some trigger that comes from the UI. In hexagonal, that's called the inbound or primary. What I'm saying is that when I click the roll dice button, that's a UI trigger to tell the domain, go roll some dice. And how that is split across a service.
The domain isn't rolling dice. You're doing the dice rolling in the game service.
Right. So there's application layer, right, which is the coordinator, and then there's domain. So domain itself knows nothing about rolling dice. It just knows about dice that have been rolled.
Right.
It is the application, in this case, the game service, that basically says, hey, I need 5 dice or 3 dice or something. And this is where one way we could do it is say, roll dice. And so what we're currently doing is we're giving it, all 5 dice, but sort of the combination of the ones that were kept is handled elsewhere, basically in the dice roller. It might be better if that information was in the, well, it sort of is in the dice roll. So but there is something here that in the dice roller that really feels like shouldn't be in a service.
So reroll, we get the kept dice from somewhere.
Comes from the UI.
Comes from the UI. Right here.
Right.
When we reroll,
yeah,
we keep.
These are the ones that we want to keep.
Oh, actually, they're coming from the game service. The
Well,
game service knows what the last roll was.
Yeah, so it knows what the last roll was, so that we can say you check these check boxes. So we're going to keep it from there. It's a bit of dicey code, no pun intended.
It is a little bit dicey. So the ultimately the kept dice are coming from the game object.
Yeah, right, because you basically say, give me the complete last roll, and then I know I've selected the first, third, and fifth one, and then I'm going to tell you that that's the ones that I want to keep.
Okay, let me look at the actual controller. So we're gonna right here. It's looping through, and it's making a bunch of checkboxes.
Right.
I saw your VOD of this one.
This was, if you're going to ask me what does this mean, I might have to punt a bit and say, let me see.
Right. It's making a bunch of checkboxes.
Yeah.
Is this basically a loop here?
Yeah. So so there's an implicit loop on, or not an implicit, there's an explicit loop line 62 where it says th each. So it pulls out a die from the roll, and there are going to be 5 of them. And for each one, it creates a checkbox and then displays that value. And so when you submit, what you get is the indexes for the ones that were selected.
Okay.
So it doesn't care about the dice roll itself, the die value itself. It says just what are the indexes into it. And that translation of UI to then be the kept dice is split across this keep DTO. So this is an inbound object that comes in from the browser.
How is that? How do we know that keep is being used there?
Because it's the parameter to the post method in the controller.
Okay, so
yeah, so here's more magic of
Spring magically converts the form data to the keep.
Correct.
To the keep object.
Exactly.
Interesting. So that just magics it up.
Yeah, it basically converts because the way the checkboxes are going to be submitted, it's the same form. It's the same name with multiple different values, and so then we just pull out the numbers themselves.
Okay. So reroll gets a list of kept dice. We get keep here. We get the dice values.
So so this is converting indexes into the list into the dice roll to the actual values on the die.
Right. So yeah, this does sort of come back to what I'm wondering is, could we simplify this? And this is not a loaded question because, again, I've not looked at this in advance. So I'm genuinely asking you this. Could we simplify this if we did more in the UI before handing off to the domain? So what if getting the roles was purely a UI level thing? And then once we have all 5 roles, then we tell the domain, bam, here's our 5 roles. Is there anything that the domain can do with that other than store it and hand it back to us?
I'm not sure. And we're going to have to ask you to say that again because...
Yeah. Well, there's a comment in the chat which might help me clarify. So Swiggy says, I have to admit I'm confused as to what James means when he says UI. By UI, I mean the web page, the controllers, the interaction with the user through the web page. So when the page is displayed to the user clicks the checkboxes, the user says post, or whatever the button is, reroll, and it comes back to our code. All the code that handles that is UI. So what I'm asking is, should the decisions about do we keep, how many times can you do that and what you keep, can we keep that all in the UI layer rather than doing some of it in the domain layer?
So what I'm hearing is that you're saying keeping some state in the UI layer.
Yeah.
I'm not.
The UI is inherently stateful.
Sure. And it's a matter of sort of synchronizing that state. So that's what sort of the current UI does. And I will admit that it is a bit tricky, therefore confusing. And I would be more than happy to say that this could be cleaned up and made a little bit more obvious what it's doing.
Let me put it another way. Imagine that you did have a single page app. You wouldn't be going back to the server every time somebody rolled the dice.
So, well, now we're talking about like, so let's see. So if we had a single page application,
I mean, if we imagine it as a single page application or even a mobile app, that sort of makes the distinction between UI and not UI a little.
No, I would still only do one post, one round trip. How would you see? So basically, on the UI, the state would be which ones you selected to keep or to reroll, whichever way you want. So we're talking about keep. I want to keep these, so I've selected them. No communication has happened to the back end.
Right.
Now I say reroll, and so it sends, here are the 3 that you want to keep.
Yeah, that's probably a bad example because for security reasons, you'd want the rolls happening on the back end, not the front end.
Well, yeah, right.
But yeah, what I'm basically saying is that so Swiggy in the chat said we could draw parallels to an actual game of Yacht, and what the player is doing is application/UI, and what's in the rulebook is domain. And that's kind of where my head is at as well. And I wouldn't say it's quite that crisp and obvious and clear necessarily. But what I'm thinking is, and also keep in mind that I like my domains to be stateless when possible. So if we keep the state in the application layer and we just collect the die rolls in the application layer, in the UI layer, and then we hand off to the domain layer saying, here's our dice, score this for me.
So what I want to be clear is you said UI and then you threw in the word application.
Yeah, application layer and UI are the same thing.
So
for me, for A-frame architecture.
So the application. So in that case, let's use the example of a mobile app. Where does application live? On the phone or on the back end?
It's not a great example because if you're doing a single page, I shouldn't have brought it up because it's a little more complicated.
Okay.
If you're doing a single page app or a mobile app, you're going to have a front end and you're going to have a back end for front end, and then you're going to have a domain layer, and you actually have 2 separate code bases in that case.
Right.
So on the front end, you would have mostly a lot of UI, but you would have a tiny little bit of domain logic. And on the back end, you would have an API, which would be a little bit of application logic, and then you'd have a lot of domain logic.
Right.
So I don't know if that actually works really well as an example or not.
Yeah, I mean, that's what sort of Hexagonal is sort of designed with that in mind. Like there's even you basically always have the service, the application layer that you plug in the different transformers, translators of the outside world, whether it's an API of this kind or messaging of this other kind. And so that's where I'm struggling with, like, I'm not sure where you're proposing to move how many dies to roll.
Let's just do it.
Right.
Let me try navigating. So coming back to this, I think we're both agreed that DiceRoller specifically is not doing a lot, right?
Right.
Yeah. So the one thing that I think we can do to sort of pull on this thread, and what we will probably do eventually is we're going to move into an A-frame architecture approach to the UI, but let's hold off on that thought for a little bit. What we can at least do is eliminate DiceRoller.
Yep.
And one way we could do that is just by inlining it into game service.
Sure. That always works.
Yeah. So let's just inline it.
Okay. So that's fine. And we're going to basically sort of ignore the tests that are testing this directly. I think that's fair.
Yeah. While you're doing that, I'm going to just take a look at the way game service is tested to see if we need to bring those tests over or if they're redundant.
Okay. So I'm going to inline and not remove the method, and then we can decide separately to remove it.
That sounds good.
So let's inline, inline keep. This is the only usage.
So I'm not actually seeing a game service test.
There are variants, but there aren't a lot of game service tests because so the main game service tests that exists are not against game service specifically. They're more adapter specific. So that's why there's not much against game service itself.
Okay.
So inline. Oh, I know why, because I'm doing it from the wrong place. Okay, so here, we're going to inline this. Keep the method. I should have started with roll, so let's do that. So inline this. Keep the method. That was hilarious. And now we'll inline this. Oh, we got a yellow card from live coding. What does that mean?
What did you say?
Live coding through a yellow card. What did I do?
Yeah, I don't know.
Let's see. So game service reroll. Oh, dice count is not going to be available. That's fine. We'll continue. This. Oh, it's really. And.
So yellow cards are first warning for puns. Live coding says.
Oh, all right. Did not know that. Let's move this here. So move that, and that's going to game service. So now the problem is, how does game service needs access to a die roller. So we would need to
just make it.
Go.
You don't need to pass it in.
We can just make it. We will make it here. And create that field. And the magic of Nullables. And now we have a die roller. And we don't need this. Okay. So now, let's run our tests.
So I think the fact that game service doesn't have a meaningful tests of its own, I see that as a code smell.
So the reason that happened is because game service came to life as literally a middleman, full delegation. And so I didn't feel the need to test code that was basically delegating. As I added more non-delegation code, I wrote tests for those. That's why assign role has tests that have more to do with, did I notify correctly? And same thing for whatever else the other one was.
Right.
one of the other methods. So that's why it's not specifically. What I'm really testing is, yes, game service, but that the side effect that I want is what I was testing.
Right. You're using a mock for that testing of game service. I'm looking at the code in my window.
Yeah.
But for everybody else, why don't you pull up that game service notification test real quick?
So, oops. Yeah. So what I'm doing here is
you're doing an interaction test. Am I interacting
correct
with the adapter, the notifier?
Right.
To make sure it's actually notifying.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. And is the same true for the other game service test?
Yeah. So the other game service test, game service, it's actually the fetcher.
Game service average fetcher test, I think it's called. Unless you've renamed it.
Why am I not seeing it?
That's interesting. It's in my code. Yeah, there it is. Right above your highlight.
I don't know why I'm not seeing it. Okay. It was weird that it wasn't games.
Yeah, that was weird.
I think IntelliJ is a little confused because I saw that before earlier
its
today.
Index gets garbaged.
Yeah. So here, right, that's what it's doing. So it's basically here I'm plugging it as a stub because it's fetching information. I don't need an interaction test. I can say, well, if the service always returns this, then this is what we expect to see when we ask for the averages.
Yeah. Okay. So it is effectively tested. It's just I was expecting it to have both of these tests in one test class instead of two, which is not a big difference. Okay. I interrupted you while you were inlining. Where are we at on that?
So it's all inlined. So the only remaining usages of DiceRoller, it's the Bootstrapper itself to create it.
Is the test passing?
I thought I saw a failure.
Yeah, we might have to pass in that die roller.
Yeah. So here's the reroll generates new roll, including kept dice. So that's failing.
Is that the only one that's failing?
That is the only one that is failing.
So this is a little bit of a big change, but my suggestion would be to just eliminate the dice roller and have game service not delete the dice roller yet, but just have on line 39, just pass in the die roller directly. Or am I looking at the wrong one?
So this is the test that failed.
On line 21, yeah. So instead of saying new dice roller, die roller, just say die roller and modify the game service to take the die roller instead of a dice roller.
That's going to be... So we want to basically have the caller pass this in? Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay.
But I was going to do it in a bigger step, which is not necessarily a good thing.
So I'm going to do it this way. And then... then we'll fix this one to be using the die roller. So let me pull this out because this is a bit confusing. This is the... All right, so now we're passing the die roller. Now that's the one that's being used. Let's run our tests. Okay, so they're all working.
Mm-hmm.
So now
we should be able to get rid of the dice roller.
Dice roller is still used here.
Mm-hmm.
What do we want to do? So so I think this is the only reference to dice roller. Yeah, so this is the only usage. So now we just need to replace this one. So what is reroll? Did we say this is just die roller multiple? But that returns.
So this is rolling 5 dice.
Right.
So we just need to make.
And
I think we just say, what does game.roll dice do?
Oh, game.roll dice?
No, I think that's it. That's what we wanted to do. What you got there.
Yeah, so that was really impressive that IntelliJ suggested that.
Except that 5 should be our constant.
Oh, yes, absolutely. What am I doing? And now IntelliJ smartly suggests wrap using DiceRoll from.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah. So let's run our tests.
Swiggy asks a really good question, which is game.roll dice does not actually roll dice, correct?
Yeah.
It's a good question.
It does not roll the dice. It accepts a roll.
Right.
This is an artifact of the split that I had done a couple weeks ago. So yes, this is probably a bit confusing because it does not actually roll the dice. It is.
Let's come back to that. I'm making a note. We'll come back to that. We'll rename it.
So a trick that I use sometimes is if it's really egregious, I'll deprecate it and basically say this is a bad name. It's not rolling the dice. So that way, if you see it, it keeps reminding you that, oh, that's not great.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. And now do all of our tests still pass?
No, now we seem to have some failures. My guess is there's some places where so let's see. Let's go to the test. Let's flip this around. Right, so as expected.
Same thing.
Yeah, same thing. So we'll just pass in DiceRoller. And I expect... let me turn off that. So here, probably the same thing, yes. Although... that one's create null. And I think actually they're all that way. Yeah. This one is the DiceRoller. That should narrow it down by 2. Or 1. Did I fix this one wrong?
Looks like you've got a...
Probably our central method is, yeah. Yep. Bucky Buck asks if it's an open source project. Yes, it is. If you go to that repo, you'll find it. Okay, so that should narrow down a few tests. Yep. Let's go to this one. This one is the same thing. And now we got one left. This one is also same thing. All right. Let me just run the slower tests as well. Make sure that we haven't broken anything else, because I think in our application. Oh, that's fine. Actually. All right.
So now we should be able to get rid of DiceRoller, correct?
That's right. We should be able to. So let's see. Yes, in fact, IntelliJ is suggesting
DiceRoller, not DiceRoller.
Yeah. Remove the field. Go for it.
And we should be able to remove it from the parameter list.
Yeah. Really?
Ooh.
Why does it? I don't believe it. I think it's
probably
wrong.
the test.
I think it's. Yeah, it's probably. Let's see if we're. Well, let's. Before we do that, we'll do a commit as a save point. So. And then we can always amend that commit to make it a bit more descriptive.
Yeah.
So let's see what happens. Safe delete. Delete anyway. Okay, I want to try a different way.
What was wrong with that?
So this is where it would save delete doesn't actually, which basically I think does a change signature underneath. It won't go and delete basically places where it's doing something like this.
Oh, so even it doesn't know that it's
even though we're really not using it, it thinks that so he just says there might be a side effect. But I'm curious if a direct change of signature will do that. Now it's the same problem. Oh,
no.
Actually, that
seems
did.
to have gotten rid of it. Yeah.
So that's interesting. So that to me is a bug in the safe delete, because to me that's the same thing.
Yeah.
It was just initiated in a different way.
Well, one of them has the word safe in it. The other one doesn't.
That's true.
You're holding yourself up to a high standard when you give something in the UI the name safe.
Yeah. All right. Well.
All right. Do me a favor and look at Yacht Control or Yacht application real quick. Make sure that came across properly.
Yeah. Yes, in fact, that's no longer needed. So remove that. This time.
No. No, you're right. We don't.
This is right here.
Yeah.
So let's run all tests. Tests say yay.
Okay.
So I think now we can do the official commit for this.
Well, not yet. Let's actually delete the DiceRoller class.
All right. Oh, right. All right, let's do that. So. Yeah, so that we can get rid of. Get rid of that. And get rid of that. Get rid of that. That's fine. Where else is it used? I guess we can get rid of the DiceRoller test class.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Well, would you mind just grabbing these and putting them somewhere? Because I want us to re-implement those tests on game service.
Yeah, so let me rename this, because this is eventually going to be a game service DiceRoller test, maybe.
Yeah.
All right, so we'll save that one for last. What else is using it? So this can be deleted, and that can be deleted, and the game service, the one that it can't find. I think that actually is fine. And where else was it used? The one that we just renamed. I think that's it. So we're going to delete this. 7 usages. But we saw that it's only this test that we're going to redo. Yeah, so I'm going to delete it. Thank you, IntelliJ, for that window size. So Sugi mentions reroll test. Well, it's actually roll and reroll because it does test the roll here in addition to reroll. So it's testing both. All right. So other than this, which has can
we just comment out all the tests in here?
Yeah, maybe that's just easier.
Blanket thing to do. I've got a note to put the comments on.
There we go.
Or put the tests on.
Okay. Let's run our tests. Well, roll might be used in every test. I'm not sure that it's actually verified in every test. It probably is pretty well covered, but still.
I've got a little bit of heartburn about the inline you did of the reroll logic, that's not being properly tested anywhere.
Okay.
So that all worked, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's check that in. I would say that what we've done is we've inline DiceRoller into game service.
Sounds good.
Okay. You want to take another break?
Yes, I was going to say this is a good time for a break. All right.
See you in a few minutes.
See you in a few.
Okay. So we got about 40 minutes left. And what we're doing is, so we've inlined DiceRoller. We've gotten rid of DiceRoller, which is nice. What we still need to do is figure out how to get those tests over, I think.
Yeah.
But before you do that, let's just look at what we did and ask ourselves if this was an improvement or not. So line 37 seems like a pretty clear improvement. Or definitely not worse. Like, I think that reads real clearly. We say roll dice, we ask the die roller to roll all the dice, and then we tell the game that we've rolled the dice.
Yep.
And then down for reroll, what does that look like?
It's no, I mean, I think we could probably still improve that a bit, but it's certainly no worse than it was spread across. I mean, what I don't like about it already existed before, so there's actually a little bit less now. So yeah, I think, and what we're saying is, reroll takes a list of kept dice. I mean, I might say maybe we put this into a method, but other than that, so this is still a little clunky, but it's not horrible. Yeah,
it's a little clunky, but I think that's because the fundamental abstraction. I think it's partly. I think part of what makes it clunky is the actual user experience is a little bit clunky, where you're doing the check marks to say which ones you keep. I don't know. There's something about that.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking if we changed it to which ones I want to discard, would that be easier?
I know as a user, when I saw you demonstrating this, my thought was it's not which ones I want to keep.
It's which ones I want to. Literally, which ones I want to reroll. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Or and that sort of matches the language that we're using. But I don't think that's certainly not a change I want to make with you, because I don't think it's interesting enough to it doesn't really get at the heart of sort of this architectural nullable stuff that we're talking about.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's a little clunky that we're talking about kept dice instead of. Well, but you still have to talk about kept dice.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing is, like, I think I when I did this, so for those who are watching, I did all the development of this on stream, it was a couple years ago, so all of it's up on YouTube. So if you want, you could probably watch where I do this and struggled with it. And I seem to remember that it was easier this way to keep track of that than the other way. But I agree, it's sort of, at some point you still have to figure out which ones am I holding on to, because you've got to hold on to them.
Right. I have a note that we want to rename game.rolldice. Let's do that before we get those tests back in place, just because it's quick and easy.
Okay.
And I want to ask, what's the difference between roll dice and reroll? Oh, reroll tells us that we have used up one of our rerolls.
Right.
I think it's a little odd that we have a roll dice and a reroll, personally. I think the idea is you get 3 rolls total, right?
Correct. So we could consolidate it to just roll, or whatever name we call it.
But let's do that some other time.
Yeah, I think there's
we're at risk of derailing ourselves.
Yeah, I think there's something there, but it is also not really a higher level thing.
So here's my proposal as sort of a straw man for you to improve. That we call it register initial roll and register reroll.
So the word register rubs me the wrong way for some reason, but if we use the word handle, I might be okay with that.
Oh, handle gives me the same creepy vibes. So, because I see so much code, there's certain words that people use as like filler words when they don't know what to name something. Yeah. Argym, I don't know, says accept roll. Yeah, or accept roll. Yeah.
So it's
use roll.
What was the last one?
Use roll.
Use roll.
How about rolled?
Yeah.
Dice rolled and dice re-rolled.
Yeah, there's some sense that and that's why handle is sort of the poor man's sort of event handling, but really it is an event that happened in the past. We've rolled them. And this goes back to sort of what Suiki was saying about the application is doing the handling of the physical stuff and the rule book. And so the physical stuff, we've rolled it, and now we're basically telling somebody that I like that. Yeah.
So let's call it dice rolled and dice re-rolled.
Now it's no longer a bad name.
And the dice roll class bugs me too.
What bugs you about
Is there a domain term for the handful of dice that you have?
I seem to remember looking for that. Nothing springs to mind. We could go look if you'd like to take that time.
I'm looking it up now. It's probably not going to be helpful.
Domain is hard, especially when there is no sort of term for it. So where are you looking so I don't look in the same place?
I'm looking at the Yahtzee. I know this is yacht, not Yahtzee, but I'm looking at the Yahtzee rules on Wikipedia. How about hand? It keeps talking about poker categories. So, dice hand?
It's hand.
The other thing that I'm thinking is dice rolls, maybe. Dice set? Dice. I guess dice roll
could be dice round. Is the only that's a term that's used as this idea of a round.
Mm-hmm.
But
kept dice?
I think kept dice would be more confusing right now because of the kept thing that is.
Yeah.
What are you holding on in between the rolls?
I think it's like a hand of cards. It's your hand of dice. Or just dice.
I'm just processing that.
Yeah.
Okay, dice is interesting. I think I like hand better than dice.
Mm-hmm. Just hand as opposed to dice hand. It's just hand.
It's just hand.
Just hand.
It happens to be of dice. Yeah. Because I'm just sort of thinking about, like, here's a hand with a bunch of die, hand of these dies.
Yeah, one of my first thoughts was, instead of dice hand, call it hand of dice, which also, I'm a big fan of using big, complicated, long domain names that are super explicit.
Yeah.
Especially and then over time figuring out better names.
I think a good middle ground is hand of dice.
Okay, yeah, let's do that.
Yeah. Have we done a commit?
We haven't, but I thought we could do these 3 names.
That's fine.
Changes and then commit. We did do the commit on the
on the bigger
DiceRoller.
Right. So we're saying hand of dice.
And I think the rest of the names you've got in here are fine, like die rolls and die 1, die 2, etc. I think those are all fine.
That's probably all fine. I'm wondering, what is it asking me? That's a bug. It's like, you already did the refactor. What else do you want from me? Yeah, those big renames, it's like when they work, that's great. Sometimes, though, it's like, what?
Yeah.
But it's more the renaming of, like, parameters and things that seems to trip it up. But that seems to work.
If you wouldn't mind just running all the tests,
just
for my peace of mind.
Yeah, usually what I do is run the regular the fast tests, and if everything is good, then run the all, because it's sort of the fail fast. And if it didn't fail, then I run everything else. Yep, everything else seems to work.
I do have to say, I love that that your slow tests are 1.3 seconds.
Yes,
like that's fantastic.
That's slow for me. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's go ahead and check that in.
Yep. Let's do that.
I think what we've done here, feel free to correct me, but I think what we've done here is we've improved dice rolling domain terms or domain names.
I'm just checking the UI. That's probably fine.
Do you have tests on the view?
I don't have tests on the actual HTML that gets generated. So that was my concern. So let me actually run the application.
Yeah.
Just to see.
One of the best things I ever did on my production code was I started putting in tests of the HTML. I just use simple regexes, like here's this place where the template is inserted. Do I actually insert what I think I'm going to?
Right.
And it lowered my anxiety so much and improved my feedback cycle, because now I can make just massive sweeping changes. And if the tests pass, bam, they pass. Okay, so yeah, we broke something.
Yeah, so IntelliJ was a bit too ambitious on one of its renames.
The hand of dice one, apparently, right?
Yeah, yes. So it looks like the scored category view didn't get updated.
Right, because hand of dice is going to be a string inside of your controller.
Yeah. So let's
but
go to my view. Yeah, so it's still dice roll here. But we're saying that we want that to be... Right, so because this method didn't change, right, so this fetches, do we want, I think we want to rename this as well, right?
Yeah, probably.
Yeah.
I'm just a little nervous to do another renaming on top of something that's broken.
Yeah, let's fix, you're right, let's fix the, oops. So this is failing because this is incorrect. So this should be end of this.
I apologize. I thought this was going to be a much simpler change, and it was up until we started doing hand dice.
So what happened? Yeah, so this is sort of the downside of IntelliJ trying to be too smart for its own good. Is it renamed the template, but didn't seem to rename the
controller that set the template value.
No, what it didn't change, and I'm kind of surprised. Let me cancel it. Let me just undo that. So this view is basically, other than building it, it's basically just a bunch of getters. When it changed the name in the template, which it did correctly, it didn't change this, which is odd.
So that should be changed to get hand of dice.
Yeah. And whether internally we call it this or not is sort of irrelevant.
Yeah.
We'll do that, but I want to get the application passing. I think that was it. Because I think that's the only view we have. So let's see. Yeah.
Yeah.
Let me just roll the dice. Yep. Yeah, let's score it as 5s. Yep. Okay, great.
Yep.
So now I want to rename this and this. And I think that's, let me run all the tests. And then I'll run the application one more time. Yeah, so so in terms of the UI test, there's actually an HTML unit library that actually makes it even easier to it's like pretty much just I mean, I could probably even write it as a, not even looking at the HTML, I could just drive it, but I tend to, especially when I'm doing stuff on stream, I tend to under-test the actual template UI part. All right, so that all looked good. Run that one last time. All right. What is the average? Okay, so I think we've caught everything, and everything is good. So let's go. There we go. All right. So what did we say we did?
We improved domain role-related domain terms.
That sounds good.
Domain names.
Oh, terms is good. All right. Commit. All right. Yeah, that's much nicer. Hand of dice. I'm liking that more and more.
Okay, so I can scratch that one off. And then the other thing we need to do is we need to put the DiceRoller tests back in. Now, I'm finding it interesting that you have your game service tests all split out. What's your thinking there?
So, if I had test-driven game service right from scratch, it would likely start out as game service test, and then if it grew large enough, I might split it among different, more sort of aspects of the thing. But because, as I mentioned, I split it and it was just pure delegation, the tests that I added were more about did it notify, did it fetch? And so that's why they're in sort of their own custom name tests, because they're really about, did you notify when the thing was, it was less about, or it was just specifically about that. So I like to organize the tests that way, just because that's the way I think about it.
Got it. One thing that I've been using a lot lately is BDD style testing tools. And so they have, they're actually, I mean, I'm doing a lot of JavaScript. I'm using a tool called Mocha, but it's very common. And it has it's a functional approach. So it says you call a function called it, which is, or you can call it test, and then you give it a string, which is the name of the test, and then you pass in a function. Right. And they can all be grouped together with describe blocks, which are just, groupings. And so what I find myself doing is I end up with much, much larger test classes that are all grouped through with these describe blocks.
Yeah.
Is that something that doesn't exist in
so JUnit has it? It's just, it turns out to be really ugly. Mm-hmm. So I prefer, I've tried it, and it's like, there's a lot of ceremony because it's Java and static typing and stuff like that. I think they could improve it, but when I've tried it, it's really just.
So there's no real way to do groups of tests other than comments and blank lines. And stuff
you can, but it just turns out to be with nested classes. It just sort of nested and lambdas and things like that. It tends to be just less readable. So what I tend to do is split out the tests. For me, what it also sort of gives me one of those measures of, wow, you've just split this thing out into 8 different separate test classes. Maybe the service is doing too much. And often that really has led me to say, oh yeah, this service is doing too much, and it should just be more concise, and there should be 2 of them or 3 of them.
Right.
So,
well, let's, in the 15 or so minutes we've got left, let's see if we can get those game service DiceRoller tests in place. And then we can talk about what we want to do next time.
Yeah. All right. So let's take this first one.
So I want to say, instead of multiple, I'm trying to scroll your screen, it's not working. So we want to test roll dice, right? And what I want to say there is actually a little different than what you've got here.
Okay.
Is it possible for us to access the game? Oh, we can get last roll. What I want to do is say that initial die roll rolls all 5 dice. And that is the same as the test you've just uncommented.
So initial, say again, initial what?
Initial roll rolls all dice. Or initial roll throws all dice, maybe might be the better way of putting it.
I was looking for a connector verb.
Yeah.
That wasn't the same letter. Initial roll throws all dice. Okay.
Or no, initial hand rolls all dice. I don't know.
Well, what's the verb here? Is throws.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm just trying to say when we call roll dice, we get all 5 of them. How about just roll dice, rolls all the dice?
Sure. Okay.
So we'll need line 11, just copy and paste it.
And so we're testing against game service. So we're going to want to...
So here's something I do a lot in a lot of my tests is I create factory functions.
Yep. I was going to go find... I know I've done this, and so I was going to go find it and move it to... So what I tend to do is I tend to leave it in the test until I start needing it. Then I factor it out, extract method. And then if I start seeing I need it in more than one test, then I pull it into a static factory method.
Does Java have optional parameters yet?
Nope.
Ah, that's a bummer.
Yeah, it is a bummer. So let's find.
So what are you looking for then?
So I'm looking for a place where I've used it, and I've written a method that that did a bunch of stuff for me. So this one looks like a good candidate. We'll call this game service factory. We'll move that. Oh, this needs to be fully qualified.
Are you making a new class called Game Service Factory?
Yes.
Okay, don't do that yet. I've got
Okay.
another strategy for you.
All right.
But we're not going to get to it this time.
Okay.
But I'll make a note of it. Just copy and paste that function for now.
All right.
Because one of the things that I do is that the things that use stuff that are nullable become nullable themselves.
Right, I remember you talking about that. So yeah.
Yeah. So ultimately, we might make a game service.create null that we then pass in the dice rolls.
Right.
To.
All right. So then this.
But I don't want to. We don't have enough time for that today.
Yeah. So this is going to be create game service with die rolls of that. Assign that to our game service. All right, so now we've got our game service. And we wanted to do roll dice. And we basically want to do something about, I think you said that there's last game service. Last roll. Why are you not? Oh, you're not imported. That's why. So that should be the same as that.
Yeah. So let's run that.
Let's see.
I really like Hand of Dice now that we have it.
Yeah. It's one of those like, oh, that's pretty good. And it's like, oh, the more we use it, the more it's like, oh, that feels really good. Whoopsie. What did we do?
What happened there? Line 38.
So hand.
Do we not have a game?
We didn't start the game. Start the game. See, you asked like what happens if we do stuff without starting the game. This is what happens. Ideally, I would put in some guard clause that says, "Hey, you haven't started the game," but but I didn't. All right, that worked.
Okay.
So
so now let's make another one that says re-rolling dice keeps some dice. And I don't think we need two different cases. I think one is fine.
I would be fine with that. Close that. So we're pretty much going to do we're probably going to do something like this.
Yeah, it's going to be awfully similar.
But instead of that being our execution, it's going to be reroll. And we're going to do list of, which ones should we keep? Let's keep the 1 and the 2. So we've re-rolled, we've kept 1 and 2. We need to provide some more dice. Actually, let's...
Do we need to roll dice?
Do we need to roll dice? If we don't, then I don't know what will happen. That would be violating a protocol of game, which is that reroll. And this may relate to sort of what you may have mentioned before, that there's sort of, maybe there's a way of combining them, but I think it would break. We could try it.
Okay. No, let's do that. Do me a favor, change the die rolls of to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then just because it makes it a little easier, or maybe even let's just do 6, 6, 6, 6, 6. And
then have different numbers here.
Yeah, and then 2, 3. And let's tell it we're going to re-roll and we're going to keep 6, 6, 6.
Okay. So then expectation
Not
here.
Trying to be occult here, but the way it worked out.
So we re-roll, keeping those, and we should get this.
And let's say the name is keep specified dice. Or provided dice.
I like specified.
Okay.
So let's run that. Yep.
Okay.
That works.
So now we can get rid of all those.
And we can get rid of the rest.
Yep.
All right.
Okay. So we've put the dice roller tests on game service, or tested dice rolling in game service.
All right.
Okay. Well, this is probably a good place to stop.
Yeah.
So let's talk about what happened today. What did we do? We spent a lot of time talking about architecture,
right?
And I don't know if it got us anywhere, but we spent a lot of time talking about it.
Well, I think you now have a much better understanding of the code base as it relates to how does the UI trigger stuff, and who's responsible for what, and what the different roles of the controller and service, and how do things get put together. So there was definitely that.
I think what still gives me heartburn about this is game service. Whenever I see classes that are doing just translation from one thing to the next, you see a lot of code that ends up with very low value, low logic translations, where you're going, I'm taking my DTO and I'm turning it into this, and then I'm taking that, I'm turning it into that, and I'm taking that. Game service triggers that reaction in me, that there's not a lot of there. And I think we've made that better by getting rid of DiceRoller and moving it into game service.
Right.
But I still feel like, and you combine that with it's a singleton. Now I know that's the way Spring likes to work, but it makes me go, it doesn't feel good,
So if every time we needed a game, we had to go retrieve it from a repository, how would that make you feel?
I would say, then let's go retrieve it from a repository and operate it on it directly.
But so this gets back to then what code would be doing that? Because the controller calls this.
I don't have any answers here.
Yeah, okay.
I just have I have an architectural smell thing going on here. And I am going to probably, after we're done, I'm probably going to take a little time and just poke around the code so I can make sure I understand it. Yep. Then I'll think about it over the course of the week in the shower. Yep. And maybe I'll have some ideas. But I just got to tell you, game service is making me feel, I don't love it. I don't love the not so much that it's a wrapper. Wrappers are fine. I use them all over the place, but because that it has a direct almost one-to-one correlation to gain.
Yeah, so I can see that, and I think that because the domain is small, it might be a bit artificial. Yeah. But for me, one of the breakthroughs I had over the past few years, really a couple of years, was finally getting a clear, sort of being able to clearly separate the domain from orchestration code. And the service is where the orchestration code happens. And sometimes there's not a lot of orchestration to do. It's basically retrieve something from the database and call the command method on it. But sometimes it's more like, oh, well, I need to retrieve this aggregate from here and this aggregate from here, and then modify this one based on this, and then push it out here, and then send a notification here. So then there's sort of more going on. And for certain things, there'll be more of that. And for some of the things, there'll be less than that. But for me, that clear separation of we're handling a desired operation that is triggered by the outside, and that sometimes it's simple, but a lot of times it's more complicated, and that'll depend on the complexity of the domain.
Yeah. Well, it's like I said, we'll look at that. So that's one of the things we did. Yeah. But the other thing we did was what we talked about doing at the end of last session, which is DiceRoller isn't pulling its own weight. Right. Let's get rid of it.
Yeah. And we did that. And we you came up with a better name.
Oh yeah, and we did some renaming, which I think actually is a nice improvement. The more we work with that, the more I like it. Go ahead and pull up the project structure if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah.
I want to talk about what we're going to do next week. So you've spent some time putting in this fetcher, and I know you've been working on Yacht sort of on your own time, or not on your own time, but doing separate streams to make it more interesting for these conversations. And so now we have this fetcher and this notifier, which is fantastic. I want to get to those at some point, but I'm still feeling like the most radical thing that we can do, and maybe this isn't the next thing to do because it is more radical, but I wonder if the most radical thing we can do here is move the UI from an adapter, which is the hexagonal approach, into the application layer, which is the A-frame architecture approach. And again, I think I'd want to look at the code to decide whether we do that, because it may just be nothing more than a move stuff around, in which case it won't really like just literally move the package here and not do anything different with it. But that to me feels like a fairly substantial difference between hexagonal and A-frame that would be interesting to explore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'd be interested to see where you end up with on that. One of the things I could do, I don't know if it's useful, is change the way the Yacht Controller is configured from the route stuff being annotations on methods to pulling the route stuff into the application. And then the Yacht Controller just becomes pure transformation, not having anything to do with routing. But I'm not sure how much that takes us anywhere.
Well, that is the kind of thing I would probably do if I were to make this A-frame, is I would put the router in the application layer and have it explicitly call out to the controllers.
So then maybe when we actually try that. So I'll go and figure out how to do that, because I don't do it very often. But maybe we do that.
Yeah. And
I have no idea what it'll look like. I don't know how much, and then we can figure out what
I mean, I'm a little concerned that that's going to feel like busy work, because then we're not taking advantage of the power that Spring brings to bear.
I mean, it's not. Let me look at some examples and we can, I can show some examples, and then we can decide if that's worth going in that direction.
Yeah. The other thing that you could do is you keep talking about, well, what if we were putting it into a database and then pulling it out?
Right.
And I hate doing design work on hypotheticals, but you're raising a good point. So maybe what we could do, instead of doing the UI stuff, we can postpone that until later, and we could just look at this question of, well, how do we work with if we were working with a database, what would that look like? If we were working with the fetcher and the notifier, what would that look like?
Right.
I don't know how much work that would be for you to actually have this persist into a database after each round.
I've done it so many times. It's okay. I've got it down to a science. So
okay, so we got several options there. Yeah. Which of those appeal to you?
I think the fetcher notifier. I think that would be interesting to do next.
Okay.
Followed by either the UI or the database or after that. But probably, I think, appealing to the audience, 95% of the questions I seem to get are around database stuff, because ultimately you do got to store stuff in the database. And there are aspects of Spring that make it really like trivial to do for better or for worse. So I'm thinking like notifier fetcher next time. And then maybe we're bored of sort of that side of the hexagon, although that's not a different side in A-frame. And then we can decide, do we want to go database or come back to the UI?
No, I think that's a nice flow, because we started out doing the nullables on the DiceRoller, but we did a really trivial nullable.
Yeah.
And then we spent a lot of time talking about architecture and boring some people to tears, I imagine. And now we can go back to nullables and look at that.
Yeah.
And maybe that will guide us back to looking at game service again and seeing what we do there.
Yeah.
So that feels good. Okay. So yeah, let's plan on probably working on the fetchers and notifiers next time, and seeing what that looks like in an A-frame architecture where they most likely be combined into a single service abstraction that was nullable.
Right. That sounds great.
All right.
I
think we're done then.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks everyone for hanging out for another stream. Thank you, James, for hanging out with us, and
it's been my pleasure. Thank you once again for hosting, Ted, and thanks to all of you for watching.
All right. See you next time. Same time, same channel. And have a good rest of your week.
Oh, and the streams are going up on YouTube, and you can find those at jamesshore.com.